You open your eyes and imagine yourself in the floodplain of the Nile, somewhere between Thebes and Memphis, about 3,000 years ago. The river is low now, glistening in the afternoon sun, and the air smells faintly of mud, baked bread, and donkey sweat. You are waiting, perhaps a little impatiently, for news. Not dramatic news, not proclamations of war or miracles, but something altogether more ordinary. A message, a letter, a papyrus scroll, carried in the satchel of a man whose only task is to move words from one place to another. The ancient Egyptians, meticulous as they were about death and gods, also had a quiet obsession with writing. The reed pen and papyrus scroll, inventions born along the Nile, turned spoken thoughts into something that could travel, slowly, tediously, but with the permanence of ink dried under the sun. Imagine the process. A scribe sits in the half-dark of a mud brick house, reed brush in hand, dipping into black ink made from soot and gum. Each stroke is careful, each sign of hieratic script meant to carry meaning far away. But once the writing is done, the real journey begins. In our time, we may sigh when a message takes more than a few seconds to arrive on a glowing screen. For the Egyptian farmer or official, a letter might mean days of waiting or weeks, depending on the distance. Couriers existed, but they were not a professional class like in later empires. Most of the time, letters hitched a ride, carried by traveling merchants, scribes on assignment, or low-ranking officials who doubled as runners. If you wanted to send word to a cousin upriver, you handed your scroll to someone trustworthy and hoped. The Nile helped. Boats could glide with the current. Sails spread wide, but still, journeys stretched long. The donkey was the unsung hero of communication. Patient, dusty, braying, often carrying more onions and grain than words. It plodded to the desert edges with a courier on its back. Imagine the scene. A satchel bouncing against the courier's side. The letter inside wrapped in linen, marked with the name of the receiver. There was no postal service as we think of it, no guarantee, no tracking number, only trust, and the resilience of animals that walked under the punishing sun. One might ask, why write it all if so uncertain? But the Egyptians had discovered something almost miraculous. Once words existed on papyrus, they could last. A thought from Memphis could appear weeks later in Thebes, almost intact. The pharaoh himself relied on such messages, his commands etched in official documents, carried slowly but surely across the kingdom. A farmer might write about a shipment of grain, a priest about temple offerings, a lover about absence. The content was often plain, even boring, but in its dullness lay its power. The letters themselves, those that survived, speak with a kind of ordinariness that feels startling. One might read, "Send me the cloak, for the nights are cold." Or, "The donkeys you promised have not arrived. I await them." No grand poetry, no dramatic declarations, just the rhythm of daily life. Yet each scroll was a bridge across distance. To send a message was to wait. Days stretched into weeks. You could stand on the dusty road, wondering if the courier had met bandits, or the papyrus had been dropped into the Nile, its black ink bleeding into the water. Messages were fragile things. A single donkey stumble might lose your words forever. And yet the system, if we dare call it that, endured. Egypt's bureaucracy, vast and careful, love records. Taxes, land divisions, temple inventories, all required scribes and letters. A grain harvest in one province needed to be reported to another. Priests required orders for ceremonies that had to be timed with lunar cycles. Couriers became invisible arteries of state, their paths winding along canals and dusty tracks. You could almost hear the shuffle of sandals, the creak of leather satchels, the mutter of a courier bargaining for food at a roadside village before continuing on. We can imagine the silence of waiting. A nobleman in Thebes wonders, has my letter reached Memphis? He counts days, scratches marks on the plaster wall, and checks the river for sails. There is no reply yet. Perhaps it has been intercepted. Perhaps it sits unopened in some official's chamber. The boredom of waiting was itself a rhythm of Egyptian life. Yet boredom was never entirely empty. While one waited for news, one also practiced patience. One learned to live without instant knowledge, to trust in distance. And sometimes the delay shaped outcomes more than the message itself. A letter asking for grain might arrive too late, when the harvest had already rotted. A plea for donkeys might reach a cousin after he had already departed for another province. Slowness was built into the bones of the system. It is strangely comforting, is it not, that the ancients, with all their monuments and gods, also wrestled with the simple problem of, how long will my letter take? They endured uncertainty, misplaced trust, and silence. Things we still know well today, only stretched thinner across time. The donkey plods on. The courier wipes sweat from his brow. The papyrus scroll bounces gently at his side. And you, in the shade of a mud-brick courtyard, continue waiting. The Nile was both the lifeblood and the slow river road of Egypt's words. If Section 1 left us waiting in a courtyard, anxious for the arrival of a donkey-borne message, Section 2 draws us upriver, where couriers became the hidden ligaments of Pharaoh's sprawling administration. To rule such a kingdom with its far-flung gnomes, its temples and quarries, and its granaries and garrisons, the Pharaoh needed not only armies and priests, but messengers. Words were as important as spears. Orders, reports, inventories, all had to move. Yet the Egyptians did not conceive of a postal service, as we do, neat and regulated with timetables. Instead, their couriers were woven into other systems. A soldier carrying dispatches might also guard caravan. A priest sent to one temple might carry a message tucked in his satchel for another. Government scribes served not just a right, but to walk, ride, and sail. To be literate was to be mobile. The courier's life was one of constant motion. Imagine the rhythm. Sunrise in Memphis. A scribe receives orders sealed with the royal insignia. The papyrus is rolled, bound with twine marked for Thebes. He joins a barge at the dock. The Nile flows south against his direction, so rowers strain their arms, poles stab the current, and the boat inches upstream. Days pass. At each village, the barge stops for bread, onions, dried fish. Children stare at the official packages as if they were treasures. The scribe guards them with care, though he knows they are nothing more than lists of grain and tax. Still, the letters carried Pharaoh's authority. A written word bore weight. Even most tedious message. Deliver 10 sacks of barley to Karnak, echoed with the king's voice. To delay it was to risk disobedience. In this way, the slow couriers were bound by duty not to the sender, but to the throne itself. And yet delays were constant. The Nile had moods. A headwind might hold a barge in place for days. Sandstorms could halt donkeys in the desert stretches. Messengers fell ill or lingered in taverns. To wait for mail was to accept interruption as natural. The gods themselves, Egyptians believed, worked slowly. The rising of the Nile was measured not in minutes, but in cycles. Messages, too, had their seasons. The work of couriers was not only to move, but to survive. A traveler had to navigate sand and sun, crocodiles along the riverbanks, the suspicion of villagers who asked too many questions. The courier's satchel was sometimes heavy with bribes and with scrolls, tokens to ensure safe passage. There are faint records of officials complaining. The message was delayed. The man lingered for drink. Others note with pride that a courier made a journey in half the expected time, hailed as almost miraculous. The donkey remained central. The animal's patience was legendary, and so too was its pace. Plodding step after step, carrying papyrus and jars of water, the donkey became a living archive of communication. Without it, words could not travel across dry fields. Boatmen and donkeys together stitched Egypt into a single body. Archaeologists have found letters that travel hundreds of kilometers. Their ink faded but still readable thousands of years later. Some are personal. A father instructing his son, a widow begging for assistance, a scribe warning of taxes overdue. Others are strictly administrative. Account of fish delivered, land measured, wages owed. When we read them today, they seem trivial. But in their day, they were urgent. A missing delivery of fish could mean a temple feast spoiled. A delayed tax report could anger a provincial governor. And so the couriers trudged on. We rarely know their names. History preserved the officials, not the runners. Yet each papyrus we find testifies silently. Someone carried this. Someone sweated, rode, bargained, and walked dusty miles just so another person could unfold these words far away. The pharaoh's mail was most sacred. orders to officials, demands for tribute, commands to temples. These were written on the finest papyrus, sealed with care, guarded by armed escorts. A courier of the king was not to be hindered. In theory, his passage was smooth. In practice, even Pharaoh's scrolls endured wind, sand, and slow barges. A god king could order the sun to rise, but not a donkey to walk faster. And so, waiting was universal. Whether you were a villager begging your cousin for more grain, or a high priest waiting for orders from Memphis, you knew the rhythm. Prepare the letter, hand it off, and wait in silence. Days lengthened. The horizon held its secrets. The messenger would arrive, eventually, or not at all. The fascinating part is this. Slowness shaped the content of letters. Because replies took so long, messages often contained layers of information, pleas, justifications, updates, all in one. You could not risk a short note. What if your letter was lost? Better to write everything, to hedge against silence. Even Pharaoh's decrees often came bundled with multiple instructions. The mail itself was bulky, padded against the risk of vanishing. We, with our instant communications, might grow impatient with such slowness. Yet, as you drift with the story, consider the quiet gift hidden in delay. Words had time to ripen, waiting forced reflection, and the moment of receiving a letter, when finally, after weeks, the courier arrived, was charged with meaning. Imagine unrolling a papyrus, smelling the faint ink, hearing the voice of someone far away. That moment was electric, precisely because it had been so long in coming. The courier has arrived at last. Dust clings to his sandals, his donkey snorts in exhaustion, and in his satchel rests a small roll of papyrus. Your message. You unfold it slowly, reed fibers crackling beneath your fingertips. The words, written weeks ago, feel strangely alive, as if they have been waiting in silence, preserved across distance by the patience of animals and men. This was the heart of Egypt's slow mail. Words that endured delay yet still carried weight. Unlike spoken orders, which vanished with a breath, letters endured the river's moods, the desert sand, and the slow plodding of donkeys. They lived through time, and in their slowness, they acquired gravity. The Egyptians, ever devoted to permanence, understood this. Their culture prized endurance. Tombs and temples were built to last for eternity. So too were letters. A papyrus might take weeks to travel a few hundred kilometers, but once delivered, it could be stored for generations. Archives from a new kingdom, still legible today, showed just how carefully Egyptians preserved their correspondence. Grain accounts, love letters, tax disputes, they were all tucked into baskets, stored in temple libraries or government offices. The result, centuries later, archaeologists could unearth them, and the lives of ordinary people whisper again. Consider the famous Amarna letters, discovered in the late 19th century. These were diplomatic tablets, not papyrus, but they reveal the same reliance on slow couriers. Kings and rulers from Babylonia, Assyria, and Mitanni wrote to Pharaoh Akhenaten. Their tone is often mundane. Send more gold. We await your troops. Do not neglect us. They are not grand poetry, but they carried the lifeblood of diplomacy. Weeks, even months, were spent waiting for replies. Entire kingdoms depended on the shuffle of messengers. For ordinary Egyptians, the rhythm was more modest. A wife might write to her absent husband, begging him to return from work on a distant estate. A priest might record offerings due to his temple. A farmer might grumble about a lost donkey or missing grain. Each letter, however plain, was a tether across space. When one reads them today, what feels most striking is the ordinariness. Boredom was not an accident. It was the texture of life itself. Slowness had consequences. A delayed order could starve a garrison. A lost message could end a ceremony. Misunderstandings blossomed easily, yet Egyptians adapted. They repeated instructions in multiple letters, sent by multiple couriers, creating a kind of redundancy. The slowness forced caution and thoroughness. Messages were not dashed off casually. They were deliberate, layered with detail, prepared for the long silence that followed. You may picture again the courier. He has handed over your letter, perhaps accepted a crust of bread, perhaps collapsed in the shade to rest. Tomorrow, He will carry another message north or east or upriver again. His life is cyclical, moving word from hand to hand. He is invisible in history, nameless, yet without him, Pharaoh's kingdom would falter. The donkey, too, deserves its quiet monument. For centuries it bore not only onions, jars, and tools, but the fragile words of an empire. Each bray, each stubborn pause, each steady step was part of Egypt's communication system. A donkey walking a dusty path was, in its way, the equal of the modern telegraph pole. Without it, voices would have been trapped in villages, never reaching distant temples or royal palaces. And so we ask, what is communication worth when time stretches long? The Egyptians lived in cycles, the flooding Nile, the waxing moon, the turning of seasons. Letters fit into this rhythm. They were not expected to be quick. They were expected to arrive. Eventually, patience was woven into life itself. Now, as you listen, think of the strange paradox. Letters that move so slowly still manage to outlast the centuries. Papyrus, fragile and perishable, survived under sand. Today, in quiet museum drawers, messages from a farmer to his cousin or a priest to a superior rest intact. Their voices are clearer to us than those of countless kings. The mail system may have been plodding, unreliable, sometimes tedious, but its product endured longer than monuments. The slowness, in the end, became a kind of immortality. And so, dear listener, we conclude our first story, the tale of Egypt's couriers, their donkeys, their barges, their endless roads. Words traveled, sometimes late, sometimes lost, but often enough they arrived. And when they did, they stitched together a kingdom. Close your eyes and imagine the endless road east of Samarkand. The sun sits high, burning against pale sand, and the caravan moves slowly. Camels swaying, bells jingling, traders muttering in a dozen different languages. The air smells of wool, dried apricots, and leather. Hidden among bolts of silk and bags of pepper is something less fragrant, less profitable, yet just as valuable: messages. The Silk Roads, that sprawling web of paths and oases stretching from China to the Mediterranean, were not merely highways of silk and jade. They were arteries of information. Long before the telegraph, long before emails and cables, merchants became the reluctant couriers of history. A man might carry silk for profit, but tucked in his saddlebags might also be a letter for a distant official, a merchant's note of credit, or a father's plea to his son studying in another city. Unlike Egypt's couriers, who trudged with donkeys along predictable paths, the Silk Roads carried words in a far more tangled web. There was no central authority commanding the flow of letters. Instead, there were merchants, pilgrims, monks, and envoys, each carrying scraps of words alongside their trade. Communication was incidental, often piggybacking on commerce. If you wanted to send a message from Kashgar, Baghdad, you slipped your scroll into the pouch of a caravan leader and prayed it survived sandstorms, bandits, and the sheer enormity of distance. The journeys were long, months, sometimes years. The caravan would pass through deserts where water was as rare as mercy, across mountain passes where snow cut the breath from lungs, into cities where languages shifted with each gate. Alongside silk, porcelain, horses, words traveled slowly but persistently. Imagine a letter written in Chang'an, the bustling capital of Tang, China. A brush dipped in black ink scratches across fine paper. The words may concern trade, perhaps a note to a distant partner about prices for tea, or something more personal, a scholar sending verses to a friend in Samarkand. Once folded, sealed, and entrusted to a merchant, the letter joins a caravan. Weeks later, after crossing the Gobi, it is passed from one caravan to another, traveling like a stowaway in the pockets of strangers. By the time it arrives, the prices may have changed, the scholar may have died, yet the words still carry their intent. The Silk Roads did not move quickly, but they moved thoroughly. What began in China could echo in Byzantium. What was whispered in Persia might be known in India. Even half-truths and rumors found their way westward. Tales of strange beasts, exotic foods, or mysterious kings. Letters carried facts, but merchants carried gossip, and sometimes the two were indistinguishable. To send a message along the Silk Roads was to surrender control of time and trust fate. The caravans themselves were miniature societies. Each camel carried not only goods, but responsibility. Caravan leaders ensured the safety of goods and messages alike, for both were precious. In some cases, letters functioned as contracts. Promissory notes, written in neat script, could be honored thousands of miles away, allowing merchants to trade without hauling mountains of coins. A slip of paper was lighter than silver, and just as valuable, but the fragility was immense. A single ambush by bandits could scatter silk, spices, and letters alike into sand. A storm in the mountains could bury a caravan, sealing words beneath snow for eternity. Silence was common. Many messages were written, fewer arrived. Families waited, uncertain whether their words or their loved ones would survive the roads. Yet despite the risks, the system worked in its slow, stubborn way. Cities like Samarkand, Bokhara, and Kashgar became hubs of information as much as trade. A message might stop at a merchant's inn for months, passed hand to hand, until someone else traveled the right direction. In this sense, the Silk Roads were less a single highway and more a giant, irregular relay race, with each traveler carrying the baton for a time. To receive a letter was to taste the world's vastness. Imagine a merchant in Aleppo opening a packet from Xi'an, reading about tea harvests or poetry contests. The words were months old, yet they collapsed continents into a single moment. It was a strange compression of distance, slow but certain, that made the Silk Roads as much about communication as commerce. The Silk Roads were not a single road, but a web of them, dusty paths, mountain passes, desert crossings, and river valleys stitched together across thousands of miles. Within this web, words moved at the pace of camels, horses, and human footsteps. If Section 1 showed us merchants tucking letters among bolts of silk, Section 2 pulls us deeper into the networks that made these messages matter, not only for trade, but for empires, religions, and entire ways of life. At the highest level, rulers used the Silk Roads as conduits for diplomacy. Think of the Han emperors of China, sending envoys west with scrolls bound in silk wrappings, their seals pressed with vermilion wax. These letters carried weight beyond grain deliveries or local disputes. They demanded alliances, gifts, or tribute. A letter might travel for months to reach a distant court, and when opened, it was treated with the gravity of the emperor's presence. Yet the time lag was immense. By the time a reply returned, the circumstances that prompted the letter might already have changed. Wars begun, kings replaced, alliances broken. The slowness of communication made certainty a rare luxury. The Persian and later Mongol empires sought to tame this slowness. The Persians devised a royal road, a kind of backbone for couriers, with relay stations placed at intervals so fresh horses could carry messages quickly. Herodotus claimed messages could move across Persia in 7 days, an astonishing feat compared to Egypt's donkey couriers. Yet, once the letters spilled into the wider Silk Roads, beyond imperial borders, speed vanished again. Empires tried to impose order, but deserts and mountains still ruled. Religion, too, rode the back of messages. Buddhist monks carried not only sutras but letters of introduction, prayers written on palm leaves, small scrolls requesting aid or protection at monasteries down the road. Christian traders in Central Asia wrote in Syriac, while Muslim merchants penned Arabic letters filled with both commerce and devotion. Each letter was a thread in the larger fabric of cultural exchange, binding pilgrims and merchants into a shared story of belief and trust. Some of the most fascinating letters were not private at all, but diplomatic gifts. In the Tang dynasty, for example, envoys might carry ornate scrolls written in exquisite calligraphy, meant less as practical messages and more as tokens of prestige. To hold such a letter was to touch art. Imagine a scroll of silk, ink brushed with deliberate elegance, sealed with a jade stamp. Even if the news inside was stale by the time of arrival, the object itself carried meaning. The letter was as much about display as communication. Merchants, however, kept the system alive on a daily basis. Their letters were pragmatic. Contracts, bills of sale, promissory notes. A merchant in Bokhara might send a slip of paper promising repayment in Aleppo, and weeks later, another trader would honor it. In this way, letters became lighter than gold, but just as valuable. They were the early veins of global finance, scribbled in cramped handwriting on fragile paper. But what of the ordinary? Amid kings and merchants, ordinary families still relied on slow letters. A son studying the Quran in Samarkand might receive a note from his mother, written by a hired scribe, telling him of the grape harvest back home. A widow might dictate a letter begging her relatives for help after a bad season. The voices of the common folk still echoed along these roads, fragile but persistent. The dangers were real. Bandits haunted the Taklamakan desert, eager to seize anything valuable, letters included. Though a papyrus or a paper scroll was worth little on the market, the information inside could be priceless. Directions, agreements, trade secrets. Some merchants disguised their letters in double wrappings or hid them in jars of dates. Others relied on oral messengers, committing words to memory, so that if robbed, nothing physical could be taken. And always there was waiting. A merchant in Aleppo might send word to Kashgar, then wait a year before learning if the message had arrived. Families lived with long silences, filling the gaps with prayers, assumptions, or rumors carried by passing travelers. The Silk Roads were as much about enduring silence as about receiving news. What survived of these letters is rare but revealing. In the dry sands of the Taklamakan, archaeologists have uncovered scraps of paper-bearing contracts and correspondence in multiple languages: Chinese, Sanskrit, Persian, and Sogdian. One fragment records a loan for horses. Another lists supplies for a caravan. Another, more personal, simply notes, "Tell my brother I am well." The handwriting is uneven, the ink faded, but across centuries the message still speaks. Slowness shaped diplomacy, trade, and faith. It forced patience upon rulers and merchants alike. It created room for rumor, exaggeration, and misunderstanding. And yet, without this slow, uncertain system of letters, the Silk Roads would not have been the Silk Roads. Trade alone could move goods, but it was communication, however halting, that created networks of trust. Picture once again the caravan, trudging westward with camels swaying. Somewhere inside a satchel lies a small folded letter. It may never arrive. It may arrive long after its urgency has faded. And yet it matters, because to write is to believe in connection. The caravan reaches its destination at last. Bells grow quiet as the camels kneel. Traders unload bolts of silk and sacks of pepper, and in the midst of the bustle a small folded letter changes hands. It has crossed deserts, mountains, and languages, passed through the fingers of men who will never meet the sender or the receiver. The ink is faded now, the edges smudged by sweat and sand. And yet, when it is unfolded, the voice of a distant soul emerges intact. This was the quiet triumph of the Silk Roads. Not simply that goods moved, but that words endured the vastness of space and time. While silks frayed and spices were consumed, letters often lingered, folded into chests, tucked into ledgers, preserved in monasteries. Many are gone, but some survive to this day, whispering to us across centuries. What is striking is how often these letters reveal the mundane. A Tang merchant might complain about rising prices of horses. A Persian trader might request repayment for a loan. A monk might ask for safe lodging at a temple along the route. They are not grand epics, but fragments of daily life. And yet it is precisely this ordinariness that makes them extraordinary. They show how empires were bound not just by armies, but by onions, camels, and ink. Some letters carried poetry. The Silk Roads were not just for traders, but also for scholars and artists who exchanged verses. Imagine a scroll traveling from Chang'an to Samarkand, filled with elegant couplets praising the moon or lamenting separation. By the time the recipient read them, months had passed, but the words carried fresh emotion. Poetry, like silk, traveled slowly but glittered when unfolded. Others carried secrets. Codes and ciphers appeared in some merchant letters, a precaution against prying eyes. A few contained double meanings, known only to sender and receiver. In this way, the Silk Roads became a corridor not only for visible trade, but for invisible trust. The Mongols, centuries later, would attempt to accelerate everything. They built the Yam system, a chain of relay stations where couriers could change horses, rest, and continue. Marco Polo himself marveled at the speed. Letters could fly across Asia faster than any caravan. And yet, even then, slowness remained relative. A journey that once took years now took months. To us, that still feels glacial. But to the people of the time, it was breathtaking. Still, the essential truth lingered. To send a letter was to surrender to distance. Whether carried by a monk's satchel, a merchant's pouch, or a royal courier's saddle, the message entered a vast, unpredictable current. Once sent, it belonged as much to fate as to ink. And so we reflect on the rhythm of life shaped by this slowness. Imagine waiting for news of a distant partner. Imagine years passing before you learn success or failure. Imagine hearing rumors before letters, whispers at caravanserais contradicting the official word. Truth became slippery, stretched across time. Letters did not merely inform. They transformed patience into a daily discipline. Yet the gift was immense. When a letter finally arrived, it carried more than words. It carried the vastness of the world. To read of tea harvests in China while sitting in Aleppo was to glimpse another universe. To receive a lone note from Samarkand was to trust that the threads of commerce stretched further than the horizon. Each letter was a reminder that the world, though large, could be held together by ink. And now, centuries later, archaeologists kneel in desert sands, brushing dust from scraps of paper. On them, faint lines of ink still cling. The words may be partial, the meanings obscure, but the effect is the same. Voices return. We do not know if the letters ever reached their destinations, but we know they existed, and in their existence, they prove that even the slowest of messages can outrun time itself. So the silk roads hum with silence once more. Camels leave faint tracks, winds scatter the sand, and the bells fade. Somewhere in the dust, perhaps still buried, another letter waits, waiting to be found, waiting to be read, waiting to speak again. High in the thin air of the Andes, where mountains rise like jagged teeth into the clouds, words did not travel by donkey, camel, or boat. They traveled by breath and muscle, on the legs of men known as chasquis, the runners of the Inca Empire. Imagine a trail carved along the cliffs, narrow as a handspan, with the sound of wind howling through the valleys. A runner sprints along it, a small pouch bouncing at his side, carrying no parchment, no scroll, but a bundle of knotted strings. This was the Inca's mail. Not words written in ink, but quipus, cords knotted with deliberate patterns, each knot carrying meaning. To us, they seem abstract, but to the trained eye, they spoke of numbers, taxes, tribute, even events. A single strand of dyed cord might represent a harvest. Another, the number of soldiers conscripted. Together, they formed the language of empire, and to move them across such a vast and vertical world, the Incas relied on their runners. The Inca road system was immense. Over 25,000 miles of stone paths and rope bridges, stretching from modern-day Colombia down to Chile. No horses, no wheels, no carriages, only feet. Along these roads, the chasquis stationed themselves at relay posts, small huts perched along the trail. One runner would dash with his quipu or oral message, lungs straining in the thin air, until he reached the next post. There, he passed a bundle to another, who took off instantly. Like beads strung across the empire, these runners linked mountains to valleys, coast to highland. The speed was astonishing. Though messages were carried by men on foot, the relay system meant they moved faster than many horse-based couriers elsewhere. A message could travel hundreds of miles in just a few days, an empire stitched together by lungs and legs. But speed did not lessen the silence of waiting. Imagine a village elder in Cusco sending word to a far valley about an order maize. He ties his knots, hands them to a runner, and waits. The runner's path is perilous. Bridges made of woven grass swaying above chasms. Trails where one misstep meant a fall in the clouds. Icy winds biting through thin tunics. And yet the runners pressed on, trained from youth to endure. They carried more than quipus. They carried spoken words as well. Many were human memory devices, memorizing oral messages to deliver word for word, as if their very bodies were living letters. It is worth pausing on the quipu itself. To modernize, it is baffling. Strands of colored cords knotted in patterns. But to the Incas, it was a ledger, a diary, sometimes even a story. Each knot had place value, each cord a category. Some quipus recorded census counts. Others tracked tribute paid in maize, textiles, or labor. A runner carrying one was not only delivering data, but the backbone of administration. Without these cords, the empire's intricate tribute system would collapse. The waiting, again, was part of the rhythm. To send a quipu from one region to another was to trust the runners, the paths, and the gods of the mountains. Sometimes storms blocked the passes. Sometimes bridges collapsed. And always there was a fatigue of distance. A message from the coast might take days to send into the highlands. The people in the mountains knew the silence well. They learned to expect that words arrived when the mountains allowed. There are faint echoes of the runners in Spanish chronicles. Conquistadors arriving in the Andes marveled at the swiftness of the system. They reported seeing runners space along the road, shouting to one another before exchanging messages. Like the flight of birds, one wrote, the words leapt from man to man. And yet, the same conquistadors destroyed much of the system, dismissing the quipu as primitive. In truth, it was anything but. Pictured again, the runner's sandals slap against stone. His chest heaves in the thin air. In his pouch, the knotted strings shift with each stride. Far ahead, another runner waits, ready to take his place. The empire depends on their rhythm. Each footstep is an echo of authority, of tribute, of connection. And you, perhaps, are waiting in a small Andean village. You do not know when the runner will arrive, only that he will. You look to the ridgeline, to the thin path that cuts across the sky. Somewhere up there, words are moving toward you, knotted cords swaying like tassels of meaning. The Inca Empire was vast, stretching across mountains, deserts, and coastlines, binding together more than 10 million people under a single sun god. To keep such an empire alive, it needed lungs. The chasquis, the runners, were those lungs, carrying breath from one end of the Andes to the other. Without them, orders would suffocate, tribute would falter, and the empire would fall silent. In the capital Cusco, the heart of the Inca world, decisions were made that rippled outward like the flow of the Urubamba River. The Sapa Inca, seated in golden splendor, could command entire provinces with gesture, but only if his words could travel. And so, when he needed to summon labor for a great road or temple, the order was tied into cords, entrusted to runners, and released in the web of stone paths. The relay stations, known as tambos, dotted the roads like beads on a necklace. Every few miles, a small hut or shelter stood ready, stocked with food, water, and blankets for the runners. Inside, a man waited, lean, fast, accustomed to thin air. When he saw a runner appear on the horizon, he braced himself, lungs preparing for the sprint. The arriving runner would hand off the quipu or recite the message breathlessly, and then collapse to recover while the next dashed off. In this way, words leapt forward without pause, as though the empire itself were running. The Spanish chroniclers compared it to a chain of fire, each link sparking the next. They were astonished that messages could cross hundreds of miles so swiftly. From Cusco to Quito, orders could travel in mere days. In comparison, Europe's messengers often took weeks to cover similar distances. The Incas, without horses or wheels, had forged a system that rivaled, and in some cases surpassed, those of the Old World. Yet it was not just speed that mattered. The system was built on memory. Chasquis were trained not only to run but to recite. Many messages were spoken, committed to memory, and passed like an incantation from mouth to mouth. Imagine hearing the same phrase, repeated with precision by dozens of men, carried across mountains until it reached its destination almost unchanged. The runners were living scrolls, their breath the ink, their voices the script. Still, the quipu remained a backbone of official record. Each knot, each cord, was a bead of information. Tribute owed, maize harvested, soldiers conscripted. Some quipus even recorded histories and laws, though much of this knowledge was lost under Spanish rule. To carry one was to carry the empire's data, fragile, portable, yet essential. A single cord might decide how many men were sent to build a road, or how much food was distributed to a village. Consider the terrain. The Andes are no gentle hills. They are cliffs, glaciers, valleys carved by rivers like silver knives. The runner sprinted up slopes where breathing is a struggle even for the unburdened. They crossed rope bridges woven of grass, swaying above chasms so deep the river below seemed like a thread of glass. They dashed through deserts where the sun baked the ground into stone. And always, they carried words. Waiting for these words was part of Andean life. A provincial leader might gaze toward the mountains, scanning for a distant figure, hoping the next quipu carried news of tribute reduced or labor forgiven. Farmers awaited orders on planting cycles, coordinated by messages from Cusco. Soldiers on the frontier awaited confirmation of reinforcements. The silence between messages was filled with uncertainty, but also trust. Everyone knew the runners would come. The Spaniards, when they conquered the empire, marveled at this trust. They could burn records, destroy temples, even kill leaders, but the memory of runners lingered. Some Spaniards even tried to use the Chasca system themselves, recognizing its efficiency. Yet, without understanding the quipu fully, the system withered. What had been the empire's lungs grew still. But in its time, it was more than a mail service. It was a philosophy. That knowledge could live in bodies as much as in objects, that memory could be as enduring as ink. The Chasquis did not simply move cords. They embodied connection. Their footsteps were the empire's heartbeat, their lungs its breath, their endurance its strength. Imagine standing at a tambo, the wind cold against your skin, watching as one runner arrives and another departs. You hear the faint slap of sandals against stone, the sharp breathing of men carrying more than themselves. You see the cord exchanged, or the words repeated, and you realize the empire itself is running past you, swift, fragile, and alive. The runner reaches his destination at last. His chest heaves, his legs tremble, and in his hand he clutches a quipu. It is a small bundle of cords, yet inside it lies the weight of entire provinces. The knots speak without sound. To the trained quipu keeper, the cords unravel into meaning. How many bushels of maize were harvested? How many men must leave their fields for labor? How many llamas were born this season? This was the final step of the Inca's message system, the decoding of knots into policy, into life. A single quipu might mean an easier season for a village, or new burdens imposed. In this way, the knots tied together not only strings, but lives. The brilliance of the quipu lies in its endurance. Papyrus rots, parchment fades, ink smudges, but knots, fiber twisted and tied, can last centuries in the dry air of the Andes. Archaeologists today still find them, their cords stiff but intact, their patterns still legible to those who study them. Though much of the language is lost, we know enough to see their role. They were archives of empire, durable as stone, portable as a pouch. Imagine the waiting that preceded such a message. A village elder in a high valley, uncertain of his tribute, watches a mountain trail for a runner. For days, the road is empty. The people wonder if their burden will grow heavier or lighter. Then at last, a figure appears, swift and small against the cliffs. He arrives, breathless, and hands over the quipu. The elder studies it, his trained fingers deciphering the knots. Relief or dismay spreads across the village. Words, in this world, came as knots that bound fates. The Spanish conquistadors, unable to read them, dismissed quipus as curiosities. Some were burned, others discarded. But they underestimated the depth of the system. The Incas had woven a form of communication that resisted decay, one built on memory and touch rather than ink. Even in silence, the cords endured. The runners themselves fade from history, without names. We do not know who sprinted those mountain trails, who risked cliffs and storms. Their lives were anonymous, yet essential. Each was a link in a chain that spanned continents of rock. Without them, the empire could not breathe. They were not scribes, not priests, not generals. They were simply legs and lungs in service of words. And still, without them, the empire would have collapsed. It is worth noting how human patience was shaped by this system. Messages came not instantly, but at the pace of footsteps and knots. To live in the Inca world was to accept delay as natural. Urgency was measured in days, not seconds. Silence was expected, and when words arrived, they were treated with gravity. The story of the Inca couriers ends, like so many things, with conquest. The Spanish toured through the empire, dismantling the roads, repurposing tambos, dismissing quipus as useless. The runners were silenced, their breath no longer carrying the empire's will. Yet even now, as archaeologists unearth knots, the voices return faintly. Each cord is a whisper of the system that once made mountains speak. The dust rises gently from the hooves of a horse. The rider leans forward, the satchel at his side, holding a message stamped with the royal seal of Persia. Behind him stretches the royal road, that legendary highway of the Achaemenid Empire, running like a vein across the land. More than 1,500 miles of packed earth and stone, from Sardis in Anatolia to the Persian capital at Susa. On this road, words flew faster than any in the ancient world. The Persian royal post, designed under Darius the Great in the 5th century BC, was an experiment in speed. Unlike the haphazard systems of Egypt or the tangled merchant relays of the Silk Roads, the Persians built something deliberate, efficient, almost modern. At intervals of about every 15 miles, relay stations were placed. Each had fresh horses, food, and water waiting. When a courier arrived, he handed over the message and mounted rider, who dashed off again, scarcely pausing. In this way, a single message could cover the empire in days instead of weeks. Herodotus, the Greek historian, marveled at it. He wrote that neither snow nor rain nor heat nor darkness of night could stop the couriers of Persia, a phrase later borrowed by modern postal systems. He described how messages sped across the empire with relentless determination, faster than ordinary travelers could imagine. Imagine the scene: a rider galloping across the plains of Anatolia, his horse foaming, his satchel heavy with papyrus or parchment. Ahead, a relay station looms. Simple wooden huts, men waiting with saddle horses. He does not dismount. He thrusts the message into another rider's hand, who kicks off instantly, hooves pounding into the dust. Behind them, the first rider slumps in exhaustion, his duty complete. Ahead, the message flies on. The Persian Empire needed such a system. Its lands were vast, stretching from the Indus Valley to the Aegean Sea, from Egypt to the mountains of Central Asia. Governing such diversity demanded communication. Tribute had to be counted, rebellions reported, commands delivered. Without a swift relay of orders, the empire would fracture. The royal post stitched it together. But speed did not eliminate waiting. Provincial governors still counted days for the king's orders. Armies still sat idle until messages arrived. Villagers still waited anxiously for decisions about taxes or disputes. Compared to the foot runners of the Inca or donkey couriers of Egypt, the Persian system was miraculous, yet silence still filled the spaces between arrivals. What is striking is how the Persians recognized the psychology of waiting. To keep officials loyal, the king had to make his presence felt even across vast distances. A sealed message, carried in haste by a sweating rider, was more than information. It was authority arriving at the doorstep. The words themselves mattered less than the fact that they came stamped with the king's mark, delivered swiftly enough to remind all who ruled. And still, risks lingered. Horses stumbled. Storms raged. Mountains slowed riders. Bandits prowled, though to attack a royal courier was to invite certain execution. Some messages never arrived, vanishing into the silence of the road. Others arrived too late, events already overtaken by reality. Even the fastest system of the ancient world could not outrun uncertainty. Imagine yourself as a satrap, a governor of a Persian province. You await the king's response to a request for soldiers. Days pass. The royal road lies quiet. Then at last, hooves thunder in the distance. A courier arrives, dust-covered, thrusting into your hand a sealed message from Susa. You break the seal. The king's voice unfurls on parchment, commanding, certain. You bow to words that have traveled faster than any before. The Persian Empire was more than a collection of lands. It was a tapestry of peoples, languages, and climates bound together by a single authority. The royal post was its thread, stitching the edges of the empire into a living whole. To rule millions stretched across deserts, rivers, and mountains, the king needed not just armies or taxes, but speed. The hoofbeats of couriers became the heartbeat of Persia. At every relay station, known as a peridoxis in Old Persian, a rhythm played out. A rider appeared, dust cloud rising behind him, his horse frothing with exhaustion. Station attendants stepped forward, steadying the animal, while another courier leapt onto a fresh horse already saddled. With no more than a moment's pause, he dashed off again, carrying the same sealed message. In this way, the king's words leapt from one set of hooves to another, covering up to 150 miles in a single day. Ordinary travelers might take weeks to cross the same ground. The system had a dual purpose: communication and intimidation. To receive a message stamped with the royal seal was to be reminded that the king's gaze could pierce across mountains and rivers. Even in distant provinces, governors felt the immediacy of the throne. A letter, arriving swiftly, erased distance. It told the satraps, "You are never beyond reach." But behind this speed lay countless ordinary labors. Horses had to be fed, watered, and kept in condition. Stations had to be stocked with food for riders, shelters for sleep, and sometimes guards to keep them safe. The empire maintained thousands of horses purely for the purpose of carrying messages. The cost was immense, yet the value was greater. Without communication, the empire risked unraveling. The letters themselves were often plain, even dull. Many concerned taxes, supply chains, or routine orders. A scroll might direct the shipment of barley, the construction of granary, or the conscription of laborers for royal projects. But dullness did not mean insignificance. Each piece of parchment was a strand in the empire's vast web, holding it taut against collapse. And still, delays were common. The royal road may have been efficient, but storms swept Anatolia, floods blocked rivers, and mountains slowed the pace. A courier might be forced to detour for days, or perish en route. Sometimes messages arrived so late that decisions had already been made without them. Yet even this imperfection was accepted. The system was not flawless, but it was better than silence. Consider a scene in Susa, the royal capital. The king dictates orders to a scribe. The words are written on parchment, rolled, sealed with clay or wax. A courier bows, tucks the message into his satchel, and gallops out through the palace gates. Within hours, the message is flying westward, from hand to hand, horse to horse. In a week, it reaches Sardis, more than 1,500 miles away. The satrap that breaks the seal reads the orders and obeys. In this moment, the empire breathes as one body, its lungs stretched across continents. The Greeks, who so often fought against Persia, could not help but admire the system. Herodotus, though fond of exaggeration, described it with awe, declaring that nothing could stop these couriers. His words carried into later centuries, inspiring postal mottos still repeated today. That such admiration came from Persia's enemies reveals how impressive the royal post must have seemed. But what of the waiting on the other side? Picture a provincial judge awaiting confirmation of a tax dispute. He knows the courier system is fast, but he still sits in uncertainty. He rises each morning, scanning the road for dust clouds. Villagers whisper, "Has the king answered yet?" Finally, hoofbeats echo in the distance. A rider appears, thrusting a scroll into his hands. At last, silence breaks. The letter may only say, "Proceed as ordered," but its arrival transforms waiting into action. The empire's breath was not constant. At times, silence stretched long, and people wonder if messages had been lost. Yet the faith in the system remained. Even with delays, people trusted that the king's words would arrive eventually. To live under Persia was to live with the certainty that communication, though never instant, was inevitable. The last rider dismounts, handing over a sealed scroll. Dust clings to his cloak. His horse trembles from exertion. The message, once dictated in Susa, has crossed plains, mountains, and rivers, carried by dozens of men and dozens more horses. Now, at last, it rests in the hands of a satrap, a governor, a soldier, or a tax official. The seal is broken, and the king's voice speaks across hundreds of miles. This was a miracle of the Persian royal post. Speed that seemed impossible in the ancient world. The system did not erase distance, but it compressed it. For the first time in human history, a ruler could command distant provinces with something close to immediacy. Orders might still take days, but they no longer took months. The royal road was not merely a highway of earth and stone. It was a river of authority. And yet, the content of these letters was often unremarkable. Most were administrative. Reports of grain harvests, troop movements, tax tallies. Some were diplomatic, sent to vassal kings or allied states, wrapped in formal language and stamped with seals. A few were urgent, demanding reinforcements or warning a rebellion. But whether dull or dramatic, each message carried the same weight. It was the king speaking. To ignore it was unthinkable. The royal post also shaped time itself. Villages along the road learned to listen for hoofbeats. Relay stations brought rhythm to the empire, each stop a marker of progress. Life adjusted to the expectation that news would come faster than before. People measured their waiting not in seasons, but in days. The empire's psychology shifted from timeless patience to an awareness of speed. Still, the system was fragile. Horses grew lame, riders fell ill, storms flooded rivers, bandits prowled the edges. The empire devoted immense resources to maintaining the flow. Grain had to be stored at stations, fodder kept for horses, guards employed to deter thieves. To sustain speed required constant, invisible labor. Without it, the road would grow silent, and silence could unravel an empire. The Greeks feared and admired this power. They knew that Persia's ability to communicate swiftly gave it an advantage in war and governance. And yet, even Persia's couriers could not outrun history. The empire fell, first Alexander and later to other powers. The royal road remained, used and repurposed by conquerors, its stones carrying the footsteps of new rulers. But the system of couriers faded, replaced by other networks. What endured, however, was the idea that messages could be made to move faster than ordinary travel, that distance could be tamed by organization. The Persians planted this seed, and centuries later, others would adopt and refine it. The Mongols built their relay posts, the Romans their tabularii, modern nations their postal services. All carried, in some way, the echo of Persian hoofbeats. Today, archaeologists trace the remnants of the royal road. They find old way stations, scraps of clay seals, faint tracks of stone. These fragments remind us that once, thousands of horses galloped across this land, bearing not just men but words. And though the riders' names are forgotten, their service lingers in the mottos and systems of our own age. Even now, we still repeat Herodotus' awe. Neither snow nor rain nor heat nor night. So, what remains is not just a history of speed, but the reflection it offers. Messages carried by the Persian couriers were urgent in their day, but many have been lost, their ink faded, their parchment gone. What survives is a knowledge that words once moved at the pace of galloping hooves. The empire is gone, but its rhythm endures. Picture the Roman Empire at its height. Marble forums buzzing with voices, soldiers drilling in dusty camps, governors dispatching orders from Britain to Syria. Roads stretch across the empire like veins, straight and enduring, lined with milestones carved in Latin. These roads carried traders, armies, and tax collectors, but also something less visible, letters. Rome was a place obsessed with writing. Senators scribbled speeches, generals sent dispatches, merchants recorded contracts, and lovers whispered on wax tablets. Yet unlike Persia's grand royal post, Rome never built a universal postal system for its people. Instead, it relied on a patchwork of couriers called tabularii, messengers who carried letters for the elite, the army, or anyone who could afford them. Often, these tabularii were not professionals at all. Soldiers doubled as couriers, delivering dispatches between legions and Rome. Slaves carried their masters' correspondence, sometimes trotting across hundreds of miles with tablets strapped in leather cases. Wealthy citizens employed freedmen as personal messengers, ensuring discretion. Letters in Rome depended less on the state than on personal networks of trust. Imagine a centurion in a legionary camp near the Rhine. He receives orders scrawled in Latin, troop movements, supply requisitions, reports of barbarian raids. He selects a soldier, perhaps a swift runner, perhaps one with a good horse, and sends him down the road. The soldier tucks the message into a satchel, dons his cloak, and becomes, for the length of his journey, not a fighter but a postman. His sword protects him not only from enemies, but from anyone tempted to tamper with the dispatch. In this way, Rome's armies carried words as often as they carried spears. But not all Roman letters were military. Merchants along the Mediterranean sent notes about grain prices, contracts, or shipment of olive oil. Families exchanged greetings and requests. Lovers sent playful verses or promises. The medium was often humble, thin sheets of papyrus, parchment, or wooden tablets coated in wax. A stylus scratched words into the wax, later smoothed over to reuse the tablet. These letters were tucked into wooden cases called capsi, sealed with string and wax, and sent along roads or ships. Waiting, however, defined Roman correspondence. A senator in Rome might send a letter to a governor in Hispania and wait months for a reply. Messages carried across the Mediterranean risked storms, piracy, or shipwreck. A wax tablet might dissolve in seawater, its words vanishing forever. The sender could only trust and wait. Yet despite delays, the system was astonishingly robust. Rome's roads were masterpieces of engineering, straight and durable, with bridges spanning rivers and causeways cutting across marshes. Couriers could move quickly compared to their ancient peers. A letter from Gaul might reach Rome in a week. One from Syria might take a month. For the ancient world, this was remarkable. Still, letters were precious because they were rare. When Pliny the Younger wrote to his friends, he did not expect instant replies. Months might pass, and yet he still began letters with affection, as though no time had gone. Cicero, whose vast correspondence survives, often complained of delays, yet he kept writing, producing a body of letters that still reveal the heartbeat of Roman politics and private life. The tabularii, then, were more than couriers. They were the thin line between presence and absence. To send a letter was to project oneself across distance, to make one's voice heard in another city. For soldiers far from home, a letter from family might be more precious than pay. For senators, a timely dispatch could shift politics. For lovers, a wax tablet could carry longing that crossed seas. Imagine yourself as a Roman waiting for a reply. You rise each morning, scan the horizon, and ask the same question. Will the messenger arrive today? Days pass, weeks pass. Then at last, footsteps echo down the road, or oars slap against the harbor. A tabularius arrives, dusty, travel-worn, holding a tablet sealed with wax. You break the seal, smooth the wax with your fingers, and hear the voice of someone far away. The genius of Rome lay not only in conquest, but in connection. Its armies could seize provinces, but its roads held them. And along these roads, words travel in the hands of tabularii, those anonymous couriers whose sandals wore grooves into the empire's veins. If Section 1 showed us soldiers pressed into service as messengers, Section 2 draws us deeper into the everyday rhythm of Roman correspondence. Who wrote, who carried, and how the empire lived with delay. The Roman road network was vast, perhaps the greatest achievement of the empire. Viae stretched across Britain, Gaul, Hispania, North Africa, the Balkans, and deep into the Near East. Paved with stone, marked with milestones, and patrolled by soldiers, they were arteries of movement. Merchants hauled goods, armies marched, and couriers trotted steadily, letters tucked in leather pouches. For the first time in history, a letter could leave Londinium and plausibly reach Rome in weeks, not years. But Rome's system was not democratic. There was no universal post for ordinary citizens. The state maintained the cursus publicus, an official courier network created by Augustus, but this was reserved for imperial business. Governors, generals, and high officials used it to send reports to the emperor or to relay his commands. Swift horses and fresh riders were stationed along its roads, much like Persia's royal post, ensuring speed and security. To use it without permission was a crime. Private citizens had to improvise. Wealthy Romans relied on their household slaves or freedmen as messengers. Cicero's letters to Atticus, for example, often mentioned trusted slaves carrying sensitive political updates. Merchants used hired tabularii, professional couriers who charged fees to carry correspondence. For those without wealth, letters often traveled by chance, handed to a friend, a traveling soldier, or anyone heading in the right direction. It was a system built on trust, patience, and luck. The letters themselves were diverse. Some were wax tablets, reusable and practical, written with a stylus that could be smoothed over. Others were sheets of papyrus, rolled and tied, sealed with wax stamps bearing the sender's mark. A simple letter might be just a few lines, a greeting, a request, a reminder, but many were elaborate, filled with legal arguments, philosophical musings, or even jokes. The Romans wrote to persuade, to cajole, to remember, and sometimes simply to fill the silence. One can imagine a senator sitting by lamplight, dictating to a scribe, "Write to my colleague in Gaul." remind him of his debt, inquire about his health, and warn him of unrest in the Senate. The scribe scratches on papyrus, folds the sheet, seals it with wax. A tabularius takes it, straps on sandals, and sets off. Days later, he arrives in a dusty frontier town. The letter is opened. Cicero's words or Pliny's greetings suddenly present in a world far from Rome. And always there was waiting. Cicero often complained of the slowness of letters, fretting when news lagged. Pliny the Younger, writing to friends, sighed over long silences, yet filled them with more letters. The empire's correspondence was a constant game of anticipation. A message sent in January might be answered in March. To live with letters was to live with uncertainty. For soldiers, the waiting was sharper. A legionary in Britain might write home, his letter carried by a fellow soldier on leave. Weeks later, his family in Italy might read his words, smudged with damp from the sea voyage. I am well. The rains are endless. Send olives. By the time the family replied, months had passed, and the soldier might already have moved to another camp. Letters were bridges, but shaky ones, swaying over gaps of time. Yet despite delays, the effect was profound. Letters connected provinces of Rome, families to absent sons, governors to emperors. They were the invisible web that kept an empire from dissolving into fragments. Even when late, even when lost, the act of writing sustained the illusion of presence across distance. But danger lurked, too. Couriers risked bandits along lonely roads. A wax tablet stolen could expose secrets of politics or trade. Messengers sometimes tamper with contents, or fail to deliver them at all. Roman writers often complained of unreliable couriers, lamenting how words might be altered or vanish. Trust was fragile, yet essential. To send a letter was always an act of faith. Imagine a dusty roadside and along the Via Appia. Couriers gather for the night, sharing bread and wine. Their satchels hang by the door, filled with letters sealed in wax. Each envelope represents someone's hope, a lover's affection, a merchant's demand, an emperor's order. The inn grows quiet, the lamps dim, and the letters wait in silence until dawn. At sunrise, sandals slap against stone again, and the empire's words continue their march. And so we pause with this reflection. When letters depend on soldiers, slaves, and hired strangers, is communication a privilege or a gamble? The courier arrives at last. His sandals are frayed, his tunic damp with sweat, and in his pouch lies a small packet, a folded sheet of papyrus, sealed with wax. He hands it over, and for a moment, the entire distance between sender and receiver collapses. Someone in Rome speaks now in Hispania. Someone in Britain whispers into Asia Minor. The empire breathes, not with the clash of swords, but with the scratch of stylus and the shuffle of messengers. This was the enduring paradox of Rome. An empire of roads and armies, remembered for its conquests, yet held together by words carried slowly in hands of ordinary men. The tabularii, soldiers on duty, slaves compelled, freedmen entrusted, and hired couriers paid by coin, became the veins of communication. Their lives were unremarkable, yet without them, the empire would have been blind and deaf. The letters they carried reveal the everyday pulse of Rome. In the Vindolanda tablets, unearthed near Hadrian's Wall in Britain, we find fragile wooden slips covered in ink. They are not decrees of emperors or orders of generals, but human fragments, requests for more beer, complaints about cold weather, invitations to birthday parties. A soldier's wife writes to her friend, I shall expect you, sister, on the third day, for my birthday celebration. Such words travel across bleak frontiers, carried in satchels, arriving days or weeks later. To us, they are priceless. To the Romans, they were simply life, written down. For the elite, correspondence was both politics and philosophy. Cicero's letters reveal alliances forming and fracturing, plots whispered, favors asked. Pliny's letters are polished, meant to endure as literature, yet they still speak of daily rhythms, baths taken, gardens admired, cases argued in court. These letters depended on the tabularii, who ferried them across the empire. The survival of Roman thought, in many ways, rested on the legs of messengers. But danger shadowed every letter. Roads, though paved, were not free of risk. Bandits could strike. Storms could delay ships. Careless slaves might lose or damage tablets. Secrecy was fragile. Wax seals could be broken and resealed, messages intercepted. Writers often cautioned recipients not to trust a courier fully. To send a letter in Rome was always to gamble. Would your words arrive, unchanged, intact, and in time? Still, the gamble was worth it. For a legionary on the frontier, a letter from home was as valuable as gold. For an emperor, a report from a governor might decide war or peace. For merchants, a contract scribbled on papyrus meant trust that spanned seas. Letters were fragile threads, but threads nonetheless, tying Rome's vast expanse into a single cloth. The act of waiting shaped Roman psychology. People grew accustomed to silence, to long gaps without news. They filled these spaces with rumor, speculation, or hope. And when the courier finally appeared, when the wax was broken, the relief was profound. The voice of a loved one, a friend, or even an enemy arrived not instantly, but with the gravity of distance endured. The Roman Empire eventually crumbled. Its roads cracked, its armies scattered. Yet letters endured. Cicero's words still live. Pliny's polished epistles still circulate. Vindolanda's tablets still whisper a frontier life. The couriers are gone, their names forgotten, but their labor remains etched in history. Without them, much of Rome's voice would have vanished into silence. So, as the courier hands over a final message, dust clinging to his sandals, we are left with this reflection. Perhaps Rome's true empire was not its legions, but its letters, the fragile, ordinary words that still speak to us today. The abbey is quiet except for the scratching of a quill. Candles sputter, wax dripping slowly, and a monk bends over a sheet of parchment. His fingers are stained with ink, his back bent from hours of copying. Outside, the bells toll. The wind rattles against stone walls. But inside, the scriptorium is a world of silence broken only by the faint rasp of feather against skin. Epirs in the Middle Ages. Letters began not in speed, but in stillness. Unlike Rome's bustling networks of tabularii, the medieval world was slower, narrower, more isolated. Yet words still needed to travel, between monasteries, castles, bishops, and kings. The monks became the key to this fragile tradition. They wrote not only books and gospels, but also letters, dispatches, and requests, each stroke of ink carrying meaning that might take weeks, months, or even years to arrive at its destination. Picture a monk in the 10th century, tasked with drafting a letter from his abbot to a neighboring monastery. The request is mundane: more candles of winter or a loan of books. He sharpens his quill with a small knife, dips it into black ink made from oak galls, and begins. His letters are careful, precise, each curve a prayer in itself. He writes on parchment scraped from animal skin, expensive and thick, meant to endure. When finished, the sheet is folded, sealed with wax, and handed to a messenger who carried these letters. Rarely professional couriers. More often, travelers pressed into service. Monks on pilgrimage, merchants passing between towns. Even peasants paid a coin to walk with a sealed packet. Sometimes knights bore them, tucked beside swords and armor. The routes were uncertain, the pace glacial. A letter might linger for weeks in one monastery, waiting for someone heading the right direction. It might ride in a saddlebag through rain, or rest in a pilgrim's pouch alongside relics and crumbs of bread. Waiting was inevitable. A bishop in France might write to an abbey in Italy and not hear back until half a year later. Kings wrote to popes and waited, not days but months, for the reply. Silence stretched across Europe, broken only by rumor, and yet letters still mattered, because even late, they carried authority. A wax seal, stamped with a crest, meant the words within had weight, even if delayed. Many letters were astonishingly ordinary. A monk might ask for parchment, or for the loan of a manuscript. A prior might complain that supplies promised had not arrived. Yet others were deeply personal. Spiritual advice, confessions, gentle words of encouragement. For isolated communities, letters were lifelines. To receive one was to hear a distant voice in a lonely world. But the fragility was immense. Roads were poor, often muddy tracks plagued by bandits. Storms delayed travelers, wars blocked routes. A letter might vanish without trace. Monks often began their correspondence with apologies for lateness. Forgive a delay, for no one came who could carry it sooner. In this way, delay was expected, even excused, part of the rhythm of life. And yet, there was endurance in the slowness. Parchment survived when papyrus crumbled. Some letters from medieval monasteries still exist. Their ink faded but legible, their wax seals cracked but intact. Through them we glimpsed the quiet exchanges of a world that moved at the pace of footsteps and ox carts. Imagine yourself as an abbot, waiting for news of a shipment of wine promised from a distant monastery. Winter deepens. The barrels do not arrive. You pray, you wait. Finally, in early spring, a messenger arrives, carrying a folded parchment sealed in wax. Inside, the letter apologizes. The rivers froze. The barrels will come when thaw allows. Months of silence are explained in a few calm lines. And so, dear listener, we pause with this thought. If words take months to arrive, do they lose urgency, or do they gain a kind of solemn weight with time? The letter leaves the scriptorium. Its parchment folds are stiff, its ink still smelling faintly of oak gall. A wax seal glows red, stamped with the crest of an abbey. Now the true journey begins, not in silence but in uncertainty. A messenger, perhaps a lay brother, perhaps a hired traveler, tucks it into a pouch at his side and steps out into the muddy road. The world between abbeys is no quiet cloister, but a landscape of forests, rivers, and dangers. Medieval Europe was crisscrossed by roads, but most were little more than dirt tracks. Rain turned them to mud, snow buried them, and bandits haunted the lonely stretches. Messengers carried not only letters, but often small parcels, candles, coins, or bread for the road. A wax-sealed parchment was precious, not for its material, but for its meaning. To tamper with one was sacrilege. The seal itself, marked with a bishop's or abbot's crest, guaranteed authenticity. A broken seal meant the words within could not be trusted. Travel was slow. A short journey might take a week. A long one could last months. Messengers paused at monasteries along the way, where they were given bread, ale, and a bed of straw in exchange for carrying other letters onward. In this way, monastic houses became informal relay stations. A letter could leapfrog across Europe, moving at the pace of pilgrims and monks. Each handoff added delay. Also trust, words passed from one cloister to another, like prayers whispered along a chain. Some letters were mundane to the point of comedy. Surviving fragments show abbots complaining of late tides, of missing cheese deliveries, of unwashed robes sent back by laundresses. Others, however, dealt with weightier matters, disputes over land boundaries, requests for relics, pleas for papal intervention. The same quill that wrote about sheep grazing in meadows might also write to Rome, asking judgment in a quarrel between noble houses. Kings, too, relied on monks with quills. Royal scribes were often clerics, trained in Latin. When a king dictated orders, monks wrote them, sealed them, and entrusted them to writers. A royal letter, with its heavy wax seal and decorated script, carried an air of absolute authority. But even a king's word moved at the same slow pace. A rebellion in the north might already be over by the time his command arrived. The crown was powerful, but time was stubborn. For those awaiting replies, patience was as common as prayer. An abbot who wrote in spring might not hear back until winter. Silence filled the space between letters. Monks often explained this delay by invoking God's will. If no messenger came sooner, then it was meant to be so. The rhythm of correspondence was woven into the rhythm of faith. And yet, despite slowness, letters bound communities together. A monastery in Ireland could write to one in France, sharing theological ideas or asking for manuscripts. Over months, a web of connections spread across Christendom, held not by speed but by persistence. This correspondence helped unify the medieval church, linking isolated houses into a common culture of Latin words. Imagine again the messenger on the road. He walks through a dripping forest, mud clinging to his boots, the letter safe in its pouch. He hears the cry of wolves in the distance, the rustle of trees. He trudges on, knowing that beyond the horizon lies another abbey, another safe hearth, another place to rest and pass along the words. And you, the abbot who sent the letter, wait by candlelight. Weeks pass. No word returns. You kneel in prayer, wondering, Was it delivered? Did the seal survive? Will a reply ever come? The silence itself becomes a form of discipline. And when, months later, a folded parchment finally arrives, the joy lies not only in the words, but in the proof that distance can be bridged at all. So we pause here with one quiet reflection. If each letter takes months to arrive, perhaps the waiting itself becomes part of the message, teaching patience more eloquently than the words on the page. The messenger finally returns. His cloak is frayed, his boots caked with mud, and at his side hangs a pouch that has crossed rivers, forests, and borders. He bows before the abbot, hands over a folded parchment, and steps back into the shadows. The seal, cracked with age, is still intact. When it is broken, a voice speaks across months of waiting. A reply from another monastery, a confirmation, an apology, or perhaps simply a blessing. This was the rhythm of medieval correspondence. Not swift, not reliable, but steady enough to hold together a world scattered across valleys and hills. Monks with quills kept it alive, not only by writing but by preserving. For when a letter finally arrived, it was often stored carefully in a chest, a library, or an archive. Centuries later, many of these survive, their ink faded but legible, their parchment curled but intact. Through them, the silences of the past are broken once more. The words themselves were often humble. A bishop thanks an abbot for sending candles. A prior apologizes for a delay in paying tithes. A monastery begs for a loan of manuscripts, promising their safe return. Each letter is a window into lives that were mostly quiet, repetitive, and practical. Yet it is this very ordinariness that gives them power. They remind us that history is not only made of kings and battles, but of men waiting for cheese deliveries and parchment shipments. Some letters, however, reach far beyond the ordinary. The papacy relied heavily on correspondence, with papal bulls sealed and sent across Christendom. These could take months to arrive, yet their authority was absolute. A letter from Rome could settle disputes in England or Hungary, even if the matter had already resolved itself by the time the parchment arrived. The words might lag behind events, but the seal still carried weight. Authority, in the medieval mind, was not diminished by slowness. The act of writing itself was devotional. To sharpen a quill, to mix ink, to bend over parchment by candlelight, all were seen as acts of service to God. To write a letter was not simply communication. It was continuation of sacred labor. Many monks began their letters with prayers, invoking divine protection over the messenger and the words. In this way, the spiritual and the practical intertwined. Letters became both administrative tools and spiritual lifelines. And waiting itself became part of faith. To send a letter and hear no reply for months demanded patience. Monks interpreted this as spiritual discipline. God's time was not human time, and silence itself could be a form of answer. In their minds, correspondence mirrored prayer. Word sent out, silence endured, and eventually, a response arriving in its own season. When we look back now, the miracle is not the speed, but the survival. Against rain, fire, war, neglect, countless medieval letters still exist. In them we read voices unassuming yet vivid. A nun asking her brother for cloth, a scholar requesting a manuscript, a monk confessing doubt. They are fragile bridges across centuries, built by quills and sealed with wax. And so the story of medieval correspondence concludes with a paradox. Letters that once took months to arrive, letters that were often mundane, letters carried by wandering messengers through mud and forest. These are the words that survived. They outlasted empires, battles, and castles. They linger in archives and libraries, whispering their patient truths. So we pause with this reflection. Perhaps slowness is not weakness. Perhaps the words that take the longest to arrive are also the ones most likely to endure. The year is 1580, and the Ottoman Empire stretches from the gates of Vienna to the deserts of Arabia, from the Balkans to the shores of North Africa. It is a patchwork of peoples and tongues, Turks, Arabs, Greeks, Armenians, Slavs, bound together under Crescent and the Sultan's seal, to rule such a vast dominion. The empire needed not only soldiers and taxes, but couriers, men who could carry scrolls across mountains, deserts, and seas, linking the center to its farthest edges. The Ottomans built their own version of a postal system, known as the Ulak system, where mounted messengers, or ulakler, sped along imperial roads. Like the Persians before them, They relied on relay stations stocked with fresh horses and supplies. Each courier carried documents rolled as scrolls, often stamped with the tugra, the ornate calligraphic signature of the Sultan. To receive such a scroll was to hold the Sultan's voice in your hands. Picture an Alak galloping across the plains of Anatolia. His horse's hooves beat a steady rhythm, the satchel at his side heavy with messages bound in ribbon. Some scrolls are official decrees, sealed with wax and bearing the mark authority. Others are reports from distant provinces, tax ledgers, military updates, lists of grain shipments. He does not linger at inns or markets. His duty is to ride, hand over the scrolls at the next station, and ride again. But not all messages traveled so formally. Alongside the official ulaks were countless informal couriers, traders, pilgrims, scholars, and wandering scribes, carrying letters for friends and families. These were tucked into saddlebags, slipped into purses, or hidden in cloth bundles. A merchant in Damascus might hand a note to a trader bound for Istanbul, asking him to deliver it to a cousin. Weeks later, in a smoky coffee house near the Grand Bazaar, the letter would finally change hands. Coffee houses themselves became hubs of news. By the 17th century, Istanbul's coffee houses were buzzing with conversation, their air thick with tobacco and the scent of roasting beans. Couriers arriving from the provinces often brought gossip alongside their letters, rumors of battles, new taxes, or the moods of distant governors. Men gathered at long tables, sipping thick coffee, trading stories and snippets of letters read aloud. In this way, the Ottoman postal world blurred. Official scrolls carried authority, but coffeehouse talk carried immediacy, waiting to find the rhythm. A provincial governor in Aleppo might send reports to Istanbul and wait months for a reply. Families wrote to sons serving in distant garrisons, knowing silence would stretch across seasons. Traders relied on letters of credit, folded and stamped, to conduct business in faraway markets. Delay was expected, and patience was woven into daily life. The letters themselves were written on paper, often imported from Europe or produced in Ottoman workshops. Scripts varied: Arabic, Persian, Ottoman, Turkish, all flowing across the page in careful ink. A letter might open with florid greetings. "May your health be as the roses in spring." Then follow the practical matter: a request for payment, a complaint about a shipment, or an invitation to a wedding. And yet, fragility haunted every word. Couriers risked bandits in the Balkans, storms on Anatolian plains, and deserts that swallowed men whole. Scrolls could be lost, delayed, or destroyed. Wax seals could be broken, tampered with. To send a letter was to accept uncertainty. And so, people trusted not in speed, but in persistence. Imagine yourself in a small Anatolian village, waiting for word from Istanbul. The road is long, the seasons pass. Finally, one evening, a rider appears, cloak flapping, horse foaming at the mouth. He delivers a sealed scroll. The villagers gather as the elder breaks the wax. The Sultan's words, perhaps a new tax, perhaps a decree of pardon, unfurl into the night air. The people listen in silence. The message has taken weeks, but it arrives with the weight of empire. And so we pause with this quiet thought. When messages arrive wrapped in seals and stamps, do people hear the words, or only the authorities stamp upon them? The wax seal is broken, the scroll unrolled, and the words of the Sultan spill into the room. To hold such a message was to feel the empire's weight, an authority that could order executions, grant lands, or summon armies. Yet behind the majesty of the tugra, the ornate calligraphic emblem of the Sultan, lay an ordinary truth. These scrolls had traveled by the hands of tired riders, through mud, snow, and dust, delayed by storms and bandits, deliver at last with sweat-stained leather satchels. The Ottoman courier system was both impressive and imperfect. The Alak messengers galloped across imperial roads, changing horses at relay stations known as menzelanes. These stations, scattered across the empire, stocked fodder for horses and bread for riders. They were supported by taxes levied on villages, meaning ordinary peasants contributed to the empire's flow of words. For them, the cost of communication was not just in coin, but in grain and labor, feeding the horses that carried royal decrees. The speed, compared to earlier centuries, was remarkable. A message from Istanbul could reach Damascus in less than 2 weeks, Baghdad in about a month. Yet for those waiting, the silence still felt long. Provincial governors wrote anxious reports, then waited for imperial replies that might be delayed by weather or war. Families sent letters to sons serving in distant garrisons, on the Danube frontier in Yemen or in Crete, and lived with months of uncertainty. Each letter that arrived was a small miracle. Coffee houses filled the gaps. By the 17th century, Istanbul's coffee houses became unofficial newsrooms. Couriers arriving from distant provinces did not only bring sealed scrolls, they brought stories. Travelers repeated rumors they had overheard in inns or marketplaces. Gossip, sometimes faster than letters, spread to the empire by word of mouth. One could say the Ottoman world had two postal systems, the official LAC network and the unofficial coffeehouse chatter. Both were essential, one carrying authority, the other immediacy. Letters themselves were often elaborate, Ottoman Turkish script, flowing and decorative, filled pages with both courtesy and command. A letter might begin with praise to God and honorific titles stretching across several lines before reaching its practical request. May your shadow never shorten. One governor might write to another before asking for reinforcements or supplies. Even mundane matters were wrapped in layers of politeness. Yet, beyond the ornament, daily life emerged. Merchants sent bills of credit, folded slips of paper authorizing transactions across distant markets. Families wrote about harvests, marriages, or illnesses. Scribes copied legal judgments and sent them to distant judges. These letters, folded and stamped, moved slowly but steadily, their fragility offset by persistence. But fragility was real. Bandits in the Balkans sometimes intercepted riders, breaking seals to plunder coins or information. Winter storms in Anatolia delayed horses for weeks. A rider might fall ill on the road, his satchel left in the care of strangers until another courier passed. The empire was vast, but the path of a single letter was narrow, vulnerable to interruption at every step. And yet, the system endured. Villagers grew accustomed to silence between scrolls, learning to wait. Merchants planned for delay, sending multiple letters by different routes, hoping at least one would arrive. Governors hedged their reports, writing in cautious tones, knowing their words might be read long after circumstances had changed. Delays shaped not just patience, but style. Imagine yourself in a governor's hall in Damascus. You have sent a report weeks ago, warning of unrest among soldiers. Each day you wait for the Sultan's reply. You hear rumors in the bazaar, fragments of letters read aloud in coffee houses. At last, an alak arrives, horse steaming, cloak torn by wind. He bows and presents a sealed scroll. You break the wax, your eyes scanning the ornate script. The Sultan's words are firm but late. Events may already have moved beyond them. Still, the seal carries weight. The empire speaks, even when delayed. So we pause with this reflection. If people rely as much on gossip as on scrolls, which truly governs official words, or the whispered ones passed in coffee houses? The ulak dismounts at the gates of Istanbul. His horse is spent, its flanks streaked with foam, its breath steaming in the cool dawn. The rider hands over his satchel to an official, who lifts out scrolls bound with ribbon and stamped with wax. Some are destined for viziers in the Topkapi Palace, others for judges, others for military commanders. The words within will shape policy, levy taxes, or command campaigns. And yet, beyond the palaces and barracks, many of these words will soon echo in an entirely different place, the coffee house. By the 17th century, Istanbul's coffee houses had become the true listening posts of the empire. Couriers and travelers arrived daily, and though their official scrolls moved upward into bureaucracy, their stories spilled outward into smoky rooms filled with chatter. A governor's decree became a rumor, a military report became a tale, a mundane tax order became an anxious discussion. In this way, the Ottoman Empire existed in two parallel forms, one written in ornate script, sealed and slow, the other spoken, improvised, and quick. The official system carried authority. The Sultan's seal was unquestionable. His tugra signed that the empire itself had spoken, but the gossip carried in coffee houses carried immediacy. Men debated over small cups of thick, bitter coffee, trading snippets of news from Damascus, Baghdad, or the Danube frontier. Some of it was wrong, much of it exaggerated, but it gave people a sense of participation. For many, gossip was faster and more alive than any scroll. Still, the Alack system endured century after century. Relay stations fed horses. Riders bore messages through rain and heat, and scrolls arrived at palaces across 3 continents. The empire's survival depended on it. Without couriers, the Sultan's words could not reach the frontiers. And without those words, the provinces could not know they still belonged to the center. Even a late scroll, arriving after events had passed, still mattered. It was proof that the empire remembered. Some letters survive today, tucked into archives in Istanbul and beyond. Their parchment is yellowed, their seals cracked, but their words still unfold. Decrees about taxes, disputes over land, pleas from governors, blessings from sultans. Alongside them survive personal letters, written by merchants or clerks, filled with the daily details of life. One complains about the price of grain. Another requests cloth from Bursa. Another praises the arrival of a long-awaited son. These are not grand pronouncements, but fragments of ordinary life, preserved because a courier once carried them across mountains and seas. Waiting shaped the Ottoman world as much as arrival. A family in the Balkans might wait months to hear from a son stationed in Anatolia. A merchant in Cairo might wait a season for word about payment from Istanbul. Silence was not unusual. It was expected. People lived with uncertainty, filling the gaps with rumor, prayer, and patience. The letter, when it finally arrived, was less about speed and more about proof. Proof that the writer still lived, proof that the empire still watched, proof that distance could be bridged. And when words failed to arrive, gossip filled the void. A traveler from Aleppo might recount a governor's decree before the official scroll ever reached Istanbul. A coffeehouse storyteller might embellish news of battles, turning delays into opportunities for speculation. In this way, official letters and unofficial talk wove together, creating a double tapestry of authority and rumor. The Ottoman couriers are gone now. Their horses no longer thunder across the plains. Their stations crumble in ruins. Their scrolls rest in archives. Yet the rhythm of their work survives in the very idea of postal systems, in the seal and the stamp, in the expectation that words can travel across nations. And coffee houses, too, survive as places where words move faster than paper, where conversation outpaces ink. So as we close this story, imagine the courier in his final moment of rest, sipping coffee in a dim room, listening as his own message, sealed and delivered hours ago, returns to him in the form of rumor, distorted and alive. He smiles, knowing that in the Ottoman Empire, words did not end when they arrived. They began again in the gossip of coffee houses, in the murmurs of markets, in the endless patience of people waiting. And so we leave with a quiet reflection. Perhaps every empire has 2 voices, the one stamped with seals and the one whispered in the crowd. Which voice, in the end, lasts longer? The sound is not of parchment rustling, but of bamboo clattering. Long before paper became common, Chinese scribes carved or brushed their words onto slender slips of bamboo, bound together with cords to form scrolls. These scrolls were heavy, sometimes weighing several kilograms, and yet they carried the most delicate cargo of all, the emperor's voice. In ancient and imperial China, communication was not a luxury. It was a foundation of rule. From the early Qin dynasty through the Han and beyond, officials depended on couriers to carry edicts across a vast empire. Mountains, deserts, and rivers stretched across the land, but still the emperor's words had to arrive, whether they concerned grain shipments, tax levies, or military campaigns. A single bamboo slip might command armies or reorganize provinces. Imagine a scribe in the Qin court, dipping his brush into black ink, writing in neat vertical strokes across bamboo. When the message is complete, the slips are bound together, sealed with cord, and handed to a courier. The courier mounts his horse, the bundle thumping at his side, and rides toward the horizon. His task is not to question, not to delay, but to carry. China's courier system became legendary for its efficiency. The Qin and Han dynasties built relay stations along imperial roads, much like the Persian royal post. Horses and riders waited at intervals, ensuring that messages could move day and night. Drums and horns announced arrivals. Meals were prepared for weary men, and stables stocked with fresh animals. Some messages travel hundreds of miles in only a few days. a marvel for their age. Yet speed was relative. For the village farmer waiting for a tax remission, or the provincial official desperate for military orders, days still stretched long. Silence was part of the rhythm. The emperors might arrive swiftly in theory, but storms, floods, or uprisings could delay couriers for weeks. A single broken bridge could sever communication across entire provinces. Waiting was not a flaw, but a condition of life. The weight of bamboo slips made messages physically burdensome. Couriers carried them in bundles, sometimes needing pack animals for the heaviest scrolls. Unlike paper, bamboo could not be tucked neatly into a pouch. It clattered with every step, its sound a constant reminder of authority. To hear a courier approach was to hear bamboo knocking together, like the echo of power itself. What made these edicts unique was their permanence. Bamboo endured where papyrus or parchment decayed. Thousands of years later, archaeologists have uncovered bamboo slips buried in tombs and forgotten caches. Many still carry the neat brushstrokes of officials, their words frozen in time. They speak of grain deliveries, punishments for corruption, records of soldiers. They are not dramatic proclamations, but the machinery of empire in everyday motion. And so, the couriers rode, across deserts in Gansu, through mountain passes in Sichuan, along river valleys dotted with rice fields. They carried the emperor's voice. Each rider was a thread in a web that stretched across one of the largest empires the world had yet seen. Imagine yourself as a provincial magistrate in Han China. You await an edict confirming your authority to collect taxes. Without it, your position is fragile. Days pass. You send scouts to watch the road. Finally, a courier arrives, horse steaming, scroll heavy with bamboo slips. You kneel as the cord is untied, and you read the emperor's will. The words are late, but they are absolute. And so we pause here with one quiet thought. When authority is carried on bamboo, does the weight of the words make them more enduring or simply more burdensome? The empire's breath moved along its roads. To govern millions across mountains and plains, the emperors of China built not only palaces and walls, but pathways of stone and dirt where hoofbeats echoed day and night. Along these arteries, imperial edicts raced outward, carried by couriers whose lives were measured in distance and delay. If Section 1 showed us the weight of bamboo words, Section 2 reveals the roads and rhythms that made those words move. The Qin dynasty, in its brief but forceful rule, laid the foundation. Roads stretched from the capital at Xianying to distant provinces, wide enough for carts and armies, straight enough to intimidate the landscape itself. Relay stations dotted the routes, stocked with fodder, grain, and rest houses. The Han dynasty expanded the system, refining it into something that could sustain centuries. Each station was staffed with clerks, grooms, and guards. Couriers arriving at midnight found lamps burning, food waiting, and horses saddled. The goal was relentless speed, for the emperor's words were not suggestions but commands. When the Son of Heaven spoke, the provinces had to answer. A courier carrying an edict did not pause for gossip, did not linger in villages. He handed over his bundle, leapt onto a fresh horse, and continued. In this way, a message could travel hundreds of miles in a fraction of the time an ordinary traveler would need. But speed was fragile. Floods could wash away bridges. Snowstorms blocked mountain passes. Rebellions closed roads. Sometimes an edict meant for urgency arrived weeks late, its commands already overtaken by events. A governor might receive orders to quell unrest only after the revolt had been crushed or lost. In this, the empire lived with a paradox, a courier system faster than any before it, yet still at the mercy of earth and weather. The edicts themselves were written with formality. They began with reverence, the emperor announcing his will as heaven's representative. They listed orders in careful brushstrokes. Taxes levied, officials appointed, punishments decreed. The bamboo slips clattered together, heavy with authority. Later, when paper replaced bamboo, the weight lessened but the tone remained. Even the plainest command bore the dignity of the throne. Waiting to find the provinces, a magistrate in Sichuan might sit in his hall, listening to the rain, knowing an edict was somewhere on the road. He could not act without it. Villagers, meanwhile, speculated. Rumors ran ahead of couriers, whispers of new taxes, of pardons, of war. Coffee houses had not yet appeared, but tea houses and markets buzzed with the same energy. The empire had two channels of communication: the official scroll sealed with cords and the rumor carried by travelers. Both mattered, one slow and authoritative, the other quick and uncertain. The couriers themselves lived between urgency and invisibility. Few names survive. They were functionaries, expected to endure long rides, bad weather, and sleepless nights. They received food and shelter at stations, but little glory. And yet, without them, the emperor's voice would have faded into silence. Their hoofbeats were the unseen rhythm of empire. Archaeologists have uncovered documents that testify to this labor. Records list the number of horses kept at stations, the grain consumed, the punishments for negligence. Some stations held dozens of animals, ready at a moment's notice. If a courier delayed, he might be beaten. If he lost an edict, execution was possible. Authority demanded not only speed, but fear. And yet, delays still happened. Even emperors could not outrun rivers or mountains. The people waiting for letters and orders learned to live with silence. They prayed, speculated, or acted cautiously until the bamboo or paper arrived. Life was shaped as much by the absence of messages as by their presence. Imagine standing at a relay station at dusk. Horses stamp in their stalls, the smell of fodder heavy in the air. A courier appears on the horizon, cloak whipping the wind, satchel thumping at his side. He does not pause. He leaps off his horse, thrusts the bundle into waiting hands, and mounts a fresh steed. Within moments, he is gone, swallowed by the road. The message continues, unstoppable. Authority gallops forward, even as night falls. And so we pause here with one reflection. If the emperor's voice travels faster than the people's reply, is communication truly complete, or only half of the conversation? The courier arrives at the provincial yamen, the seat of local administration. His horse foams with sweat, his cloak is streaked with dust, and in his arms he carries the emperor's words. The magistrate kneels, attendants unbind the cords and the bamboo slips, or in later centuries paper scrolls, are unrolled with ceremony. In that moment, the emperor speaks across mountains and deserts. His voice is not a sound but a presence, written in brushstrokes that command obedience. This was a miracle of the imperial courier system. Not that it eliminated distance, but that it made distance bearable. Across thousands of miles from the northern steppes to the rice paddies of the south, the Son of Heavens will arrive, late perhaps, delayed perhaps, but always arriving. The empire survived because its words, heavy as bamboo, enduring as ink, refused to vanish. And yet, the words themselves were often ordinary. Many edicts dealt with taxes, harvests, or appointments of minor officials. Some ordered the repair of roads or canals. Others punished corruption or praised loyal service. They were administrative more than dramatic, the machinery of governance written out in endless brushstrokes. But even these mundane instructions carried immense weight, for they linked the provinces to the throne. To hold such a scroll was to hold legitimacy. The people who waited for these words lived with silence as much as with communication. Villages wondered what new levies would be imposed. Soldiers at frontier forts waited for orders to move or stay. Governors hesitated to act without confirmation from the capital. Silence could stretch for weeks, even months, shaping decisions more than the words themselves. Rumor filled the gaps, spreading faster than couriers. Sometimes, rumor even prepared people to accept the words when they finally came. The couriers remained invisible. Their names are lost, their lives unrecorded. We know them only through fragments. A report of how many horses a station maintained, a reprimand for a delayed rider, an account of grain consumed. They were punished when late, praised only with continued duty. Yet they were the ones who made the empire breathe. Without them, the emperor's voice would never leave the palace walls. Over centuries, bamboo gave way to paper. The invention of paper in Han China lightened the load, making messages easier to carry, faster to write. But the rhythm of waiting remained. Paper scrolls might travel farther and faster, but they still faced the same storms, floods, and delays. The form changed, the slowness did not. Today, in museum cases and archaeological sites, bamboo slips and ancient paper still survive. Their ink is faded, their cords frayed, but their voices remain. We can read them thousands of years later and still hear the bureaucracy of empire. Deliver grain, punish theft, appoint this man to office. They are not poetry, but they are enduring. They tell us how a world governed itself, one courier at a time. And so we are left with this reflection. Perhaps power does not lie in how quickly words travel, but in whether they last. The bamboo slips have outlived their couriers, their emperors, even their dynasties. Their weight was real, but their endurance greater. The forest is alive with sound. Monkeys chattering, birds calling, insects buzzing in endless rhythm. Beneath the green canopy, a narrow path winds through roots and shadows. Along it runs a man barefoot. Swift and steady, a bundle strapped to his back. He carries no parchment, no scroll of paper, but a message spoken and remembered, or painted carefully on bark paper folded into a codex. He is a messenger of the Maya world, threading words through jungle pathways. The Maya, whose cities rose across present-day Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, and Honduras, were builders of temples, keepers of calendars, and masters of writing. Their glyphs, carved on stone or painted on bark, recorded kings, gods, and histories. But when it came to communication between cities, scattered as they were through forests and plains, messages moved not on wheels or animals, but on human feet. The Maya had no horses, no camels, no donkeys. Their beasts of burden were men. Runners carried goods and words alike, moving along causeways called sakbiab, white limestone roads that gleamed in the sun. These roads cut through jungle, linking temples, markets, and ceremonial centers. Along them, messengers ran with a rhythm as steady as a drumbeat, connecting the scattered cities of the Maya world. Imagine a messenger leaving Tikal at dawn. He carries cacao beans, perhaps, or a folded codex wrapped in cloth. His orders may be oral, memorized phrases to be recited word for word, or written glyphs brushed onto bark paper with black and red pigments. He runs barefoot across stone paths, through forests thick with vines, across wooden bridges that creak over rivers. At intervals, he meets another runner, hands off the bundle, and collapses to rest while the next continues. In this way, messages leapt from man to man, covering long distances in remarkable time. What kinds of words moved through these forests? Kings corresponded with one another, alliances formed, wars declared, tributes demanded. Merchants sent word of jade, obsidian, salt, or feathers. Priests exchanged astronomical calculations, sacred dates, and ritual instructions. And ordinary life, too, depended on messages. Markets arranging supplies, families sending news, marriages negotiated across towns, waiting to find the rhythm. A lord in Copen might send envoys with messages to Kalakmul, and weeks would pass before the reply arrived. Silence filled the palaces and plazas. In the meantime, rumors spread. Travelers and traders carried news faster than official messengers, often blurring fact and fiction. By the time the letter or oral message arrived, the story might already be known. Distorted by gossip, the Maya placed immense trust in memory. Many messages were oral, recited with precision. A messenger might be required to repeat a speech verbatim, word for word, as if he were the living voice of the sender. To falter was to risk miscommunication, and so memory was trained, sharpened by ritual. Words lived in breath and were carried in lungs as much as in glyphs. Yet glyphs had their place. Bark paper codices, folded like accordions, contained painted symbols that conveyed far more than a messenger could memorize. They recorded tribute lists, rituals, and histories. Few survive. Many were burned by Spanish conquerors, but those that remained show the intricate detail of Maya writing. To carry such a codex was to carry not only words, but entire worlds of meaning. Fragility haunted the system. Runners risked jaguars in the jungle, swollen rivers, exhaustion under the hot sun. Paths grew slick with rain. Bridges collapsed. Villages were abandoned. Messages could be delayed, distorted, or lost. And yet, enough survived that the Maya world thrived for centuries, its cities linked not by speed but by persistence. Picture yourself in a Maya palace courtyard. You wait for word from a neighboring city about tribute owed. The sun rises. Days pass. The plaza echoes with silence. Finally, A runner appears at the edge of the Sakbi. He stumbles forward, sweat shining on his skin, and delivers a folded codex. You unfold it, the glyphs glowing with red and black lines. At last, the silence is broken, and so we pause with one thought. If words live in both memory and ink, which survives longer, the voice carried in lungs or the symbols painted on bark? The Maya called their great road Sakbiab, white ways, built of crushed limestone that gleamed in the sun. From above the canopy, they looked like pale ribbons stretching across green forests, linking temples, plazas, and markets. For the runners, these causeways were lifelines, guiding their bare feet across jungle, marsh, and hill. Along them, words traveled at the pace of breath. The Sakbi was not just a road, but a stage. Messengers trod paths that were as sacred as they were practical. Some Sakbiab ended not at marketplaces, but at temples, where rituals and offerings greeted the arrivals. To carry words across them was itself a ritual act, blending communication with devotion. Every step, every bead of sweat, carried not just news but duty. The reliance on memory shaped the system. Unlike the Roman or Persian posts, where papyrus and parchment bore most of the burden, the Maya trusted human lungs. Messengers memorized speeches with careful precision, sometimes rehearsing aloud before setting off. Their task was not to summarize, but to recite. A king's words had to be repeated word for word, his authority carried in syllables. To alter even one phrase was to risk insult or misunderstanding. In this way, the messenger was less a courier than a living echo. But glyphs were never far away. Bark paper codices held painted records, rows of glyphs in black and red, sometimes accented with brilliant blue or yellow. They listed tribute obligations, so many cacao beans, so many bundles of feathers, or marked ritual dates aligned with the Maya calendar. To unfold a codex was to unroll time itself, for it contained not only words but the cycles of days and gods. Couriers carried them wrapped in cloth, protected against jungle dampness, though many still decayed. What survived of these writings is scarce. The Spanish, upon conquest, deemed them heretical and burned them by the hundreds. Only a handful remain: the Dresden Codex, the Madrid Codex, the Paris Codex. Each is a fragile survivor, carrying voices that once moved the hands of countless runners. They remind us how many words were lost, messages carried, delivered, but extinguished by flame. Waiting was the pulse of Maya life. A lord might send envoys with tribute demands and then wait, unsure if the response would come in weeks or months. Markets waited for news of salt caravans or jade shipments. Priests waited for confirmation of ritual dates. In the silence, people speculated. Gossip moved faster than couriers. A traveler passing through a village could stir excitement with a single story, sometimes contradicting what official messengers would later bring. Runners faced danger at every step. The jungle was not passive. It swallowed men with floods, tangled them in roots, or tested them with jaguars and snakes. A messenger running alone might vanish into the green silence, his words lost with him. Others staggered into villages half dead from exhaustion, collapsing as they gasped out their memorized speech. The system relied not on permanence, but on sheer human resilience. Yet despite these hardships, the Maya built a world stitched together by feet and memory. Cities scattered across hundreds of miles remained connected. Tribute flowed, rituals aligned, alliances formed and dissolved. The runners made the forest speak. Imagine yourself in the plaza of Calakmul. A lord awaits a reply from Tikal, his rival city. The air is thick with heat, incense smoke curling above the temple steps. At last, a runner arrives, stumbling from the Sakbi, his chest heaving. He recites the words entrusted to him, or delivers a folded codex with glyphs painted in bright red. The silence breaks, and the city adjusts to the new message, whether alliance, insult, or demand. And so we pause with this thought. When words are carried in memory as much as on paper, do they belong more to the sender or to the runner who speaks them? The runner kneels before the Lord. His body trembles with exhaustion. Sweat streaks his face, but his voice remains steady. He recites the words entrusted to him, syllable by syllable, as though the sender himself were speaking. Or he hands over a folded codex, painted glyphs on bark paper, its colors vivid despite the long road. The message is delivered, and in that moment, The forest paths that seemed endless collapse into a single point of arrival. This was a miracle of Maya communication. Fragile, slow, and perilous, yet persistent. Through jungles thick with vines, across white causeways that glowed in moonlight, the words of kings, priests, and merchants moved by human legs alone. The empire had no horses, no wheels, no metal couriers. It had runners' memory and the faith that words could outlast silence. The words themselves were often ordinary. Tribute lists noted cacao beans, cloth bundles, or salt. Alliances were proposed, feasts announced, marriages negotiated. Priests exchanged calculations of Venus's rising. Rituals timed the celestial cycles. Some messages carried warnings of war, while others carried reassurance of peace. None were meant to last forever, yet many became etched into stone steely. Public inscriptions that preserved agreements or victories. The runners' voices faded, but the stone remembered. Waiting shaped the Maya world as much as the messages themselves. Silence was common, absence expected. A ruler who dispatched envoys might wait weeks for a reply, his court filling the gap with ritual and speculation. Markets adjusted prices based on rumor, long before official word arrived. In the space between messages, patience became its own form of governance, but fragility remained. Some messages never arrived at all. A runner might fall to illness, a path might flood, or a rival city might intercept him. Entire conversations were lost to the jungle, and yet enough succeeded that the network endured. The Maya cities remained connected, not tightly, not quickly, but sufficiently. When the Spanish arrived, the system unraveled. Horses and ships carried news faster than any runner. Bark paper codices were burned, memory dismissed. Sakbiab left to sink into the jungle. The runners vanished into silence. But fragments survive. Codices hidden, steely carved, glyphs preserved. They remind us that once, words moved by feet and breath, fragile yet enduring. Today, archaeologists walk the same Sakbiab, their white stones overgrown, but still visible beneath vines. In their hands, they carry the remnants of glyphs once painted by scribes and carried by runners. The runners' names are lost, their steps forgotten, but their voices echo in the inscriptions that remain. Each glyph, each stela, is a frozen fragment of communication that once passed through living lungs. So, as the runner collapses in the plaza, his duty fulfilled, we reflect on the paradox. Perhaps the truest endurance of words lies not in their speed, but in their ability to echo. The Maya runner spoke quickly and vanished, but the glyphs carved in stone still whisper through centuries. The jungle grows quiet again. The Sakbi gleams faintly in the moonlight. Somewhere, another runner begins his journey. The square is crowded. Peasants with baskets of onions, traders with bolts of cloth, children tugging at their mother's sleeves. Then the trumpet sounds, a sharp, brassy note that cuts through chatter. Heads turn. A man in bright livery steps forward, unfurls a parchment sealed with wax, and clears his throat. He is a herald, the living voice of the king. In the medieval world, not all messages traveled in letters. Many traveled in lungs and echoes. Kings and lords relied on heralds to announce decrees in towns and villages, for parchment was costly, literacy rare, and roads uncertain. A single man with a trumpet and a scroll could turn a bustling market into a courtroom of listeners. The herald's words might concern taxes, new laws, military summons, or proclamations of peace. His voice carried the weight of authority, even if it cracked in the cold morning air. Heralds were more than announcers. They carried sealed documents, stamped with the wax insignia of kings, queens, or bishops. The seal mattered more than the words themselves, for most listeners could not read. Once read aloud, the parchment might be nailed to a church door or market post, fluttering the wind as proof of its origin. To see the seal was to know the words were true. Imagine a herald on horseback, riding from castle to village. In his satchel are several scrolls, each sealed with red wax. At the first stop, he raises his trumpet, gathers the crowd, and reads. By order of His Majesty, the tax on grain shall be increased by 1 part in 10. Groans ripple through the listeners. The herald does not argue, explain, or comfort. He reads, nails a parchment to the church door, and rides on. By evening, he has carried the king's voice through 3 villages. leaving behind paper, wax, and murmurs. Not all heralds carried bad news. Some proclaimed holidays, festivals, or pardons. Others announced royal weddings or victories in battle. For many, these proclamations were their only direct contact with the monarchy. A peasant might never see the king's face, but he would hear his words shouted in the square. In this way, heralds were both couriers and performers, half postman, half stage actor. The delays, however, were inevitable. A decree signed in London might take weeks to reach the shires. Winter mud slowed horses, swollen rivers delayed crossings, and wars made roads dangerous. A village might celebrate a royal wedding long after it had already taken place. The herald's trumpet always sounded a little behind the truth. Heralds also played roles in diplomacy. They were dispatched between kingdoms, carrying messages of alliance, challenge, or surrender. Their livery and trumpets granted them protection. By custom, they were not to be harmed, even when carrying hostile words. A herald blowing his trumpet outside a castle gate might deliver either a declaration of war or an invitation to feast. In both cases, his person was sacred. He was the voice, not the will. The life of a herald was not easy. He traveled constantly through rain, mud, and snow, carrying heavy scrolls, eating coarse bread in roadside inns, and sleeping where he could. He was trained not only to read, but to project his voice. In a noisy market, he had to shout above livestock, wind, and chatter, ensuring every villager heard the king's will. His words were law, but his lungs were the true medium.